Hello, everybody. We are back for the fourth talk about evolution. So far, we have learned what evolution is, and we have seen what natural selection is and how that is a driver of evolution. We have also looked at species and species formation and how that occurs over time. And then we've explored the branching nature of the evolutionary tree. And in the lab portion of the class, we're looking at how evolutionary trees are made. Today, what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the controversy that surrounds evolution. But mostly what I want to do is present to you the evidence that has caused us to say that evolution is no longer a hypothesis, but it is a scientific fact. So let's get started. Before we look at the evidence, we want to clarify a few things that evolution doesn't do. The theory of evolution does not explain how the Earth came about. That idea is fairly well understood by physics. The theory of evolution does not explain how life first began. That is a very important scientific question. But evolution assumes life has begun and then looks at how it changes over time after it began. Another thing about evolution is there is no ultimate good or bad. Traits can only be evaluated in the context of their environment. So it's not necessarily that the strongest of the species survives, nor the most intelligent. In evolution, individuals that have characters that enhance survivorship, enhance reproduction, those characters become more prevalent over time. And when that process is repeated over and over, we get large changes in what organisms look like. Finally, there is no goal of evolution. Think about it. Where is evolution trying to get to? Nowhere. If you understand natural selection, you will see that it doesn't have a goal. Things that are successful in an environment become more prevalent. Things that are not successful disappear. That's the idea. Aside from evolution, there are several other hypotheses about how species form, but the most important in the modern world is a hypothesis based on a literal interpretation of some versions of the Bible. And that hypothesis is referred to as creationism. And creationists specifically say that the earth is about 6,000 years old and that all the species were made as they are by God. They were commanded into existence. So that's the literal interpretation of the Bible. In essence, the debate is about whether species change over time, whether they evolve, or are constant over time. In order to look at evidence, we have to think about what we're looking for. The model of how evolution works makes predictions about the kinds of patterns we should see in nature. We can look at the patterns in nature and see if they fit the predictions and thereby support evolution, or if they refute the predictions and they don't support evolution. Science is therefore falsifiable. To be falsifiable means that before one conducts an experiment to test a hypothesis, one can imagine data that would support the hypothesis or refute it. If there is no data that can refute the hypothesis, then you are not doing science. So creationists in general do not have falsifiable beliefs. Most creationists will not accept any evidence that would make the Bible story false. They take the Bible as true. And as a result, creationists are in a bit of a quandary because creationism is not testable in this case, and therefore it's not science, and therefore creationists can't make statements about the material universe, which is testable with science. And a little thought will tell you all the successes science has had at understanding the universe that surrounds us. We can turn biblical ideas into hypotheses, and then we can test those hypotheses. And what we're going to see, and I'm going to show you this coming up, is that the data supports the predictions by evolution and refutes biblical hypotheses. So let's look at the evidence. Well, first of all, let's remind ourselves what fossils are. They are casts or impressions of formerly living organisms. And what happens is an organism dies and gets covered in some sediment. And then the organic material in the organism gets replaced by minerals. And the minerals are slightly different from the surrounding rock so that they leave an impression, a picture of the organism, and they become a permanent part of the rock. Evolution makes many predictions about fossils. They should occur, that different aged rocks will contain different fossils because if things change over time, then we expect older rocks to have different fossils than newer, younger rocks. And we'd expect that older rocks will have fossils that are less similar to modern life, and younger rocks to have fossils that are more similar to modern life. Creationism predicts that fossils shouldn't even occur in the first place, but if they do, the rocks should all be of the same age. And it predicts that the fossils should be of living organisms and that they should be randomly placed within the rock layers, right? They shouldn't be any order to them because the Earth is only 6,000 years old, so all the species were there, so the fossils should have been made randomly in the rock. So let's see what the evidence says. First, fossils are abundant. We have lots of them. They occur in an orderly sequence in rocks of different ages. They are not randomly jumbled in rock layers. Fossils sometimes resemble, but they're not the same as current organisms. And more recent fossils are more similar to living organisms than older fossils. And we can tell more recent fossils because they're in rock that we can age independently and determine is a younger rock, a newer rock. And so more fossils in more recent rock are more similar to living organisms than our older fossils. Evolution predicts that intermediate or transitional forms should exist. Now let's think about what that means. We now know that tetrapods, animals with 4 legs, evolved from fish-like ancestors. So evolution predicts that there should be some intermediate form between fish and tetrapods. Similarly, we know whales evolved from a terrestrial tetrapod, and therefore evolution predicts that there should be intermediate forms. Creationism predicts that intermediate forms shouldn't exist because they never did exist. The species are just what they are, so there was no reason for intermediate forms. Do intermediate forms exist? And if you've been looking at the right-hand side of this picture for this whole time, you'll know that they do, because here we have the family tree, the evolutionary tree of modern whales and dolphins, which are down here. And up at the top, we can see their ancestors. And how do we know that these are the ancestors of whales? Because just like whales, they have a thick bony wall around the middle ear. And that is only found in this line of fossils and in no other group of organisms on Earth. And so we have a nice orderly transition from Indohyus and Pachycetus, which were clearly land-dwelling, to these semi-aquatic organisms, to these fully aquatic organisms. And in these fossils, we see all sorts of interesting things. For example, the nasal opening slowly moves backwards. You can see it moving backwards to its current location on the top of the head, which would make sense if you had evolved from a land-dwelling organism with a nose fully in front of the face to one where it's of great advantage to have the nostril on the top of the head. We also can see that the hind legs are lost gradually, and we'll have more to say about this later on in the unit. Here's another example of an intermediate form. The earliest amphibian fossils date from about 360 million years ago. Fish fossils are known from at least 400 million years ago. So a scientist who's at the University of Chicago named Neil Shubin predicted that the missing link between them would be found in rocks 370 to 380 million years old. And there are only a few places on Earth where rocks of that age that form fossils can be found. And he went to the only one that hadn't been explored in the Arctic. He predicted that the fossil would have characters of both fish and amphibians. So he went there and he found Tiktaalik. And here is Tiktaalik. Here you can see a 360 million year old tetrapod. Here you can see a 380 million year old fish. And here you can see Tiktaalik from about 370 million years ago. And you notice that it has characters that are intermediate between the fish and the amphibians. In other words, it has some derived characters of amphibians and some ancestral characters of lobe-finned fish. And please make sure you understand that vocabulary of derived and ancestral. So, for example, it has neck, a wrist, flat head, and expanded ribs of the amphibian, but it has fins, scales, and the primitive jaws of the fish. So it is like both of them, but it is intermediate between them. Here's another example of its intermediacy, where you have the fully formed limb of a tetrapod from 360 million years ago. You have the fin of a fish, and you have this intermediate form where the bones are beginning to look like this in Tiktaalik. Finally, a third example. We have a great series of fossils of horses dating to about 55 million years ago. The modern horse stands on a single toe, on its middle finger, so it's walking around like this on its toe. And in these fossils, what we can see is that the earliest fossil we have had 4 toes. It had lost finger number 1, the thumb. And then Miohippus had only 3, and Merychippus had 3 here, but 2 of them had already begun to withdraw. And finally, in Equus, the modern horse, the fingers are down to 1 that the horse stands on. And what's really cool about these fossils is you can see the remains of these fingers, these vestigial fingers. They're still there, but they haven't completely disappeared. In the modern horse, 1 and 5 have completely disappeared. In Merychippus, 1 has disappeared, but 5 is just vestigial, and 2 and 4 are also receding. So we have many intermediate forms. So that's it for today. What we have done today is frame the argument between evolution and creationism, and then look at a couple of the hypotheses made by evolution and looked at what the creationist alternative is. And we've so far seen that the evidence points to evolution. In the next talk, we are going to look at much more evidence that supports the idea of evolution. Until then, go outside, look at nature, think about the biology of nature, and ask biological questions. And I'll see you next time.